Hmm. Hello, and welcome to Reviewing While I Draw Badly, the show where I review video games while drawing badly. Today I'll be reviewing the newest Nancy Drew game, Nancy Drew Midnight in Salem. Oh boy. So let's get started. Midnight in Salem is the 33rd mainline Nancy Drew game from Her Interactive. You control the titular Nancy Drew, beloved heroine of books dating back to 1930 and video games dating back to 1998. As a forewarning, this review is littered with spoilers, so you've now been warned. Nancy starts off the game in Europe somewhere trying to find something called the Book of Apologies. This book has a list of women that have been accused of being witches. Then the Book of Apologies gets stolen, and then Deirdre, if you remember her from Alibi and Ashes, calls Nancy and says she needs her help in Salem. The mystery we are called in to solve is who burned down the Hawthorne House, which is a historical building in Salem in the game. The girl accused of setting fire to the house is Deirdre's cousin May. May refuses to give her alibi to anyone, but claims she didn't set the fire. From there, we get to run around Salem and attempt to figure out who was responsible for the fire, and there is some overarching other plot stuff that we'll get into. I'm starting off immediately talking about the graphics, which is of course the thing that has had everyone talking about since info and screenshots and trailers for this game came out. The graphics are not good. I understand that there were quite a few problems with this game's development, and it did take 4.5 years to make, but honestly, if I didn't know that, it looks rushed. Don't get me wrong, these are not the worst graphics in the Nancy Drew series. The games date back to 1998, so it's kind of hard to top bad graphics, but they're still not good. They're really not up to the quality I'd expect for the 33rd game in a series, especially releasing in 2019. They look flat and all the character animations feel and look very forced and unnatural, much like I'm looking at animatronics with the way the arms move in a bad facsimile of real people. As a whole, the game just looks very unappealing. Real quick, just speaking of the Hawthorne House, we only really get to go there once, and it's like 3 rooms, which I found pretty disappointing, as it was really the only place in the game that had any sort of atmosphere to it that I thought was creepy. And I mean, we're talking about witches and ghosts and stuff. I expected more of the game to be more creepy. Moving on, the sound design was fine, nothing particularly special or memorable, but it didn't detract from the overall experience. Ditto with the music. The voice acting was pretty competent for the most part. The stand-up performance was Brittany Cox, the new voice of Nancy Drew. While she isn't Lani Minella, that is actually okay, and once I got past the unfamiliarity, Brittany does a wonderful job with the role, and I really look forward to hearing her voice Nancy again. The controls are hands down the most atrocious thing about this game. Nancy scoots around locations as if normal walking footage has been suddenly sped up. This wouldn't necessarily be the worst, except that also clicking in the direction you want to go or trying to get to a certain place is incredibly difficult and unintuitive. This is most noticeable in the town square where you click to move somewhere, who knows where you'll end up. Also, holding the right mouse button to look around is a nice idea, but it's awkward and hard to control, especially trying to see around objects. Same goes for rotating objects, it's just not implemented very well. Speaking of bad controls, let's move into the puzzles, starting with a cool puzzle that had terrible controls. That ghost hunting puzzle was such a cool concept and I loved the idea behind it. It really felt fresh, and for a series that's been running for 33 games, that's impressive. Basically, you're using little dials to match wavelength frequencies to each other in order to look for ghosts as the Hardy Boys. Oh yeah, the Hardy Boys are in this one. You have to rotate the dials by clicking and dragging, and it took me 4 times as long to do the puzzle because this click and drag mechanic was so poorly implemented, ruining what was otherwise a wonderful idea. While I'm shitting on the puzzles, what was up with that first one in the beginning? You open a drawer to find a little maze you have to guide a block through. Do you have to slide the block until it hits a wall to get it through the maze that way? No, nothing like that. You just simply pick up the block and drag it through a stupidly easy maze. I've been more challenged by the backs of cereal boxes. The first puzzle in a Nancy Drew game should at least be semi-intelligent. This one was brainless. Some of the other puzzles were fairly easy, but a few were actually quite creative and I had quite a bit of fun with them, and I think struck a good balance between solvable but still being difficult. Having to construct a footage timeline of the evidence locker perp was fairly easy once you figured out what you were supposed to do, but I actually had a great time with it and thought it was incredibly innovative for the series. The puzzles near the end I thought were especially strong, with the puzzle box that is currently displayed on the screen being my absolute favorite of all of them. Even with the almost unforgivably weak puzzle, I do think the puzzles and the creativity for some of said puzzles were actually one of the game's big highlights. Speaking of another highlight, kinda, the characters. The characters are mostly well-rounded, and some of them are even quite interesting. The Coven of Witches, quote-unquote, was quite fun to talk to each other about, as they had a really interesting dynamic of these three friends torn apart by a tragedy. I liked the ending for them that hints at a slight reunion and forgiveness, and I think for the most part, the characters are dynamic in personality and feel a bit like real people. On the other hand, some of the characters, like the judge and his son Jason, definitely felt a lot more flat and I thought were a lot less interesting. As I said, the voice acting was fairly good, but for some of the characters, the dialogue felt very unrealistic. There were a couple times, especially with the lawyer's dialogue, where I would sit back and go, oof, that sounds like someone wrote that because that's what they think people sound like. Often, the lawyer's dialogue would pull me right out of the game, especially at the end when it's revealed she's basically the real culprit. And now I'm going to be getting into the plot. At first I actually liked the plot alright after I finished the game. Then I started thinking about it more and I like it a lot less now. I still like the idea behind it, but I think it was maybe executed not as well as it could have been. The story itself that you play through is incredibly linear, with only one or two things to do at any one time. It often feels like you're just being shuttled from place to talk to different people. I don't generally mind linear games, but in a Nancy Drew game I want a little more freedom. The game is incredibly dialogue heavy, which can sometimes feel like a slog to get back to the mystery and the puzzles, but I do think that the idea behind the plot was pretty good. So now, let's talk about the weird stuff in the plot. Most of the really sort of plot breaky stuff happens at the end. First of all, May runs off to the tunnels under Salem while they're flooding because of rain and gets hurt, but it's never established how she got hurt. I think we're just supposed to assume that in the flooding she hurt herself, but there's really nothing she could have hurt herself on, and it just doesn't make sense. When Nancy finds her, she's not so hurt she can't be led out of the tunnels, but she is too hurt to give any help whatsoever. Of course, this is because if she could just lead Nancy out of the tunnels, there wouldn't be an ending, but it still feels fairly contrived. Speaking of things that are contrived, Deirdre getting super angry at Nancy last minute that comes out of nowhere, I think, so that she can go off and search for May somewhere else was just a big what the fuck moment for me. She just blows up at Nancy and leaves. This is of course so that you can again play as the Hardy Boys, you can meet up with Deirdre and solve the other big part of the mystery, which is finding the will. Now let's talk about the Hardy Boys existing in this game. Obviously this is not the first Nancy Drew game to have the Hardy Boys in it, although it is the first where you get to play as them. It was fun to see them appear in the game and their characterization is actually very well done. It also allowed Her Interactive to really open up the kinds of activities we can participate in, because Nancy would never go ghost hunting with homemade equipment the way the Hardy Boys do. It also allowed for the climax of the story to take place in two different locations at once, which I thought was a really interesting way to deliver those final scenes. I also really like how they explained everybody seeing the ghosts. It is a little hokey that it was Poison and Lauren's water pipes placed there by the lawyer, but I think it was still a good and reasonable twist. So since I mentioned the lawyer, let's talk about the villain, or villains technically. The overall villain ends up being the lawyer, and it's not surprising. It is very heavily telegraphed. What was a little surprising was her motivation. I thought it was going to be something along the lines of her having some kind of claim to the Hawthorne house, so she wanted to make it uninhabitable and haunted so she could take it over. No. First, she's not even the one that burned down the house. That was Tegan, May's older sister, and it was an accident. Turns out Tegan had been looking for the will and accidentally knocked over a paint can or something like that. But the lawyer was going to use that fire to get the house torn down so she can build real estate on the land. Turns out she was really unhappy with the town being stuck in the past, or so she says. And I think someone needs to explain the concept of tourism to this woman. I thought it was kind of a weird character motivation that felt like it came out of nowhere, even though there were subtle hints planted here and there. I just don't think, one and one added up to two in this case. The ending reveal was another place where her dialogue really didn't sound genuine as well. She was definitely one of the weakest written characters, which is really too bad since she was the main villain. Now we have to talk about the other villain, Jason. Jason is the person who steals the Book of Apologies at the beginning of the game from Nancy. And if that sounds kind of weird to you, that's because it is. So it's revealed that the lawyer chick basically played Jason for a fool and used him as a pawn because he's deep in debt, and she was also blackmailing him for something else he did. It is actually Jason that May is protecting by not giving her alibi because they were together at the time of the fire, but he was doing something illegal or telling her about him doing something illegal or something like that. I think that him being kind of an accomplice to the lawyer was actually a really cool idea, but I just don't feel like they ever established that he was even a viable option as a culprit well enough. For a good chunk of the beginning of the game, I thought he was just a random NPC you could talk to. It didn't really occur to me that, oh no, this is another actual suspect in this game. However, this leads to my big theory about the beginning of the game. I'm pretty sure the beginning of the game was shoved unceremoniously in last minute. It's the place where we get a tutorial on how to move around, and we also get sort of embroiled into the mystery because of a hooded Jason stealing the Book of Apologies. It feels very tacked on, and not just because of that god-awful opening puzzle, although that is a big part of it, but also because the woman who's the caretaker of this building we're in is just a shadow outside the door, like they didn't have time to render another character. And the woman behind the door claims that, oh, she doesn't like to go into this room, so she won't go into it. But then also in your cell phone, it's just a picture of the tower. She doesn't have her own picture, and it very much feels like she was a last-minute addition. It really doesn't feel like it was the original opening. I don't think it's established particularly well how Nancy got from Europe to heading close to Salem when Deirdre calls her and she says, oh, I can come to Salem, I'm close by. Yeah, if I had to guess, I would say this opening part was done at the very end. Real quick, I want to talk glitches. I didn't find very many, and some aren't technically glitches, just things that I noticed. For one, the leaves falling down outside the Perry house would sometimes clip into the house, and it was just weird. The next thing isn't really a glitch, but if you call a character with a cell phone while you're in the room with them, they will look at you and start lip syncing to whatever their voicemail says, which is very, very funny. The last glitch is something that actually really annoyed me though. So at the end of the game, it auto-saves after the big reveal, so you can't go back to your last autosave and try the other dialogue options in order to get the other endings. Normally, I just reload my last actual save and get the other endings like that. However, at some point, my save files got corrupted and I didn't notice soon enough, because at the end of the game, all I had was an autosave that had saved after the big reveal. This means that if I want the other endings, I need to play through the whole game at least one more time. And honestly, I was more than a little grumpy about that. My overall feeling about this game and the direction of Her Interactive is that I can totally see them doing better for Nancy Drew number 34. Midnight in Salem is not the death knell of Her Interactive. There's some good ideas and innovations in this game that I'd really like to see them expand on. I'm still honestly really looking forward to Nancy Drew number 34. Midnight in Salem's a bit of a stumbling block, but I don't think it's the end, not at all. And that is my review of Nancy Drew Midnight in Salem. I hope you enjoyed my review and the bad drawings. Let me know in the comments what you thought of Midnight in Salem. If you enjoyed the video and want to see more reviewing while I draw badly, hit subscribe. I'll see you in the next review, and here's a hint.